Hey gang, it's me, the Inner Nerd, and in this video I'm going to try and cover all the basic questions when starting modelling. So if you're new to modelling and want a little bit more guidance on products and a few basic processes, this video might be the one for you. To do that, I'm going to use this tiny Airfix 172 Spitfire. So let's roll that intro and get right to it. So like I said, I'll be using this 172 scale Airfix Spitfire. I've chosen this model purposefully because it doesn't have many parts and is relatively simple to build. That means I can spend most of the video talking about the stuff that you want to hear about, like air pressures, the different types of paint, and how to thin them. And before we start, I'd like to say I'm no professional, and there are 1001 ways of completing a model kit. This video will focus on the ones I've developed and learned over the time I've been running this channel. Also, I'd just like to make you aware that this video has been sponsored by AK Interactive, but I'm under no obligation to promote their product over another. So what I say throughout this video is completely my own opinion, to give you balanced guidance on what I think works best for me, and hopefully for you. With that over, let's start the kit. The first thing I like to do is carefully read through the instructions and pick out parts that can be painted separately, ones that need to be left out until the end, parts that can be detailed by scratch building, and parts that are optional. I use orange for parts that need to be painted separately for better access, or if they are a separate colour to the surrounding subassembly. These parts include ones like propellers, tyres and wheels, which are completely different colour than the rest of the fuselage. Pink is used to identify the parts that can be applied last. These are often the same parts that can be painted separately, or ones that can be easily damaged if applied early on in the build, like aerials and antennas. I use green to highlight the parts or painted areas that are optional. This is particularly useful on complicated builds where there are holes to be opened up for pylons and weapons to be attached. I also use this if the kit offers more than one variant where different parts are required to replicate different versions. Finally, I highlight parts in blue that I think would benefit from more detail through scratch building. On this part, the radio antenna can be added with fishing wire later on, so I highlighted it in the blue. Next, it's on to tools. The best advice I can give is invest in tools. When I first started, I got the cheapest of all the modelling tools and I paid the price in quality rather than currency. If you want to know exactly what tools I'm using, I've linked them all down in the description below. But I do get asked an awful lot about these tweezers. They're from Mr. Hobby or Mr. Tool, and they're called Mr. Bevel Tweezer, and the product number is MT204. These are great because they have the best of both worlds by being flat and pointy. That enables you to pick up the small bits but still have a good grip. The drill I use is Tamiya's pin vise. The drill bits are sold separately, but I advise again that you spend some money on a decent set. Cheaper sets will do the same job but won't be anywhere near as strong, and you'll spend the same money replacing them than you would buying a decent set in the first place. Finally, it's onto the tapes, and my go-to is again Tamiya. The two orangey coloured ones are regular Tamiya tape, and the white one is Tamiya tape for curves. The tape for curves is really good for outlining canopies. This tape is slightly rubbery texture and can be stretched to form out around gentle curves. Next, it's glues, and there are three types that I use. First is the regular Tamiya cement, which is a little bit gloopy and basically the same stuff as you get in the Revell Contactor and Humbrol polycement. The next one's Tamiya Extra Thin, which you can probably tell by the name that it's thinner than the regular polycement. You get a precision brush with this one, and it's much easier to apply along the panel gaps than the thicker regular type. Lastly, there is Extra Thin Fast Setting. This is the king of glues in my opinion and works exactly the same as extra thin poly cement but dries in much less time. This is the one I use most often. If you're looking to get a super glue, then I wouldn't look any further than VMS. They have a great range of super glues ranging from slow, extra thin and some specifically designed for photo etch and resin parts. I find the easiest way to apply these is to decant a small amount onto a yogurt pot lid and then using some solder wire apply the drop to the required area. I'll show you that a little bit later on when we come to assemble the kit. When it comes to sanding, I have a few options to choose from. I use cutting papers ranging from 400, 800 and 1200 grits. I use these to take down any defects in the parts that come from cutting them from the sprue. The finer grits at the back of the box range from 2000, 3000 and 6000 grit. I use these for the polishing process of models and civilian vehicles like cars and bikes. Another thing I like to use are plastic containers. I find these come in handy to keep the smaller parts, particularly the weapons and landing gear, separate from the main build. A block of foam is also useful for holding crocodile clips. These clips are great for holding smaller parts like instrument panels and landing gear, which you'll see me spraying later on in the video. And now, after all that talking, it's finally time to start building the kit. This kit is no different than most other aircraft kits, and you start with the cockpit. I carefully cut away all the small parts that are required from the instructions. For any parts that are particularly delicate, I cut off the excess plastic after it's been removed from the sprue. This is followed up by a quick sand with 400 grit sandpaper to level out any excess plastic, making the part smooth. On some parts there's also a mould line which runs down the centre of each piece. To remove this, I use a scraping method with a scalpel blade to remove the join. Other parts can have flash on the edges where the plastic has seeped between the join and the mould. Again, this can be removed with a scalpel blade by slicing off the excess and sanding down afterwards. Now that the parts have been prepared for assembly, it was time to put them together. For small parts that have little contact space, I tend to use regular polycement. This is because it's a bit thicker and is a bit more glue-like, so that the parts stick together a little bit easier. For parts that use a slotting mechanism or fit together using a panel gap, I use the extra thin cement. This one's good because it will easily seep into the join connecting the two parts. When cutting parts from the sprue, particularly the fuselage and wings, I'm careful not to cut flush with the edge. This is so some of the excess plastic is left on the edge which can be sanded smooth after it's been assembled, resulting in a cleaner join. I took extra care to get the wing root face sanded nice and level. This would make for a better join to the fuselage once the time comes to assemble it together. I also made sure any flash or excess plastic was removed from where the halves of the wings will be in contact. That again would stop any problems of a nice fit along the leading and trailing edges. A nice trick to paint the wheels easier is to drill a small hole in the base of the tyre. Then with a toothpick you can slot into the hole, enabling you to spin the part around without handling it. To mask the canopy, I started by edging the frame with Tamiya tape. Then to fill in the centres of each glass part, I use liquid mask from VMS. This dries in a rubbery latex coat and protects the part underneath from any paintwork. Before we start to airbrush, I thought it would be a good time to talk about the airbrush itself. This is my only airbrush which I use throughout the entire process of modelling, and it's a Harder & Steenbeck Evolution Silverline. I chose this one in particular partly because the colour cup is interchangeable between a small and large one, which makes the airbrush a little bit more versatile for detail and bigger spray jobs. This airbrush is also a dual action, so the air and paint flow can be controlled separately using the same trigger. This airbrush originally comes with a 0.2mm needle and nozzle setup. I replaced it with a 0.15, which I now use all the time no matter what the job. Moving on to a little bit of health and safety. For all spray jobs, no matter if the paint is toxic or not, I use a spray mask made by Moldex. This is a 7001. The mask is a replaceable cartridge type and the cartridges I use are 9200. Because according to Moldex's website, these are the ones that will stop my lungs getting filled with paint toxins. Lovely. Okay, so now I'm going to take a break and actually do some modelling again. Yay! My go-to primer, which never misses a beat, is Mr. Surfacer. This is a lacquer-based primer and can be thinned with Mr. Colour Leveling Thinner. The thinning ratio I find best is around about 40% thinner to paint. I prime all of the parts for the cockpit using Mr. Surfacer Black. Also, whilst the primer is being used, I take the opportunity to spray the propeller, tyres and spinner as well. Now it's time to add some actual colour to those parts. For this I'm going to use AK's RAF Cockpit Green Grey, and that's thin with AK Real Colour Thinner, which is about 40% as well. One thing to take note of when using AK Real colours is that they lay on very thin. It takes several passes with the airbrush for the colour to build up and become fully opaque. I find the best way to lay on this colour is almost try and dust the layers on and build up the opacity that way. Especially over a black primer, these paints give you great control with how deep you like the colour to be. Now that the colour blocking was complete, it was time to add in the details by hand. This is much easier and controllable to do using a brush. It's best to use a brush that has a sharp point over one that's small. A larger pointier brush will hold more paint and allow you to apply it more accurately over a small brush which you'll have to take several passes to cover the part. For the base colour of the metal areas inside the cockpit, I use gloss black. The gloss black is a good base coat for any metal colour since the sharp contrast of the black combined with the gloss finish helps metal paint shine more than over a matte base. For the actual metal colour, I used aluminium extreme metal from AK. These metal paints are great for replicating metal finishes because of their high metallic flake content. The more metal flakes contained in the paint, the smoother the result will be once it's sprayed. I find these ones from AK great along with the ones from Alclad as well. One thing I have found with all metal paints is they're sensitive to air pressure. I spray these ones at 8 psi so that they reduces the chance of metal flakes drying before they hit the model, which will result in a rough finish. Both AK Extreme Metal and Alclad paints are pre-thin for airbrush, so there's no need to thin them anymore from when it comes to using them. Now that all the main painting was complete, it's time to seal in the work with a layer of gloss varnish. Since I'll be using enamel-based weathering products, I use an acrylic clear varnish. It's important to use the opposite varnish or oil wash to one another. This stops one another reacting and taking away the last layer. Since acrylic is water-based and enamel is oil-based, the oil washes will not eat into the acrylic clear, so it will protect the paint underneath. The Tamiya X22 that I used has a gloss finish which sets us up nicely to apply the decal on the instrument panel. Decals tend to like a nice smooth glossy finish to stop what's called silvering. Silvering is where air gets trapped underneath the decal between the part and the carrier film. Where the carrier film is completely clear and not part of the decal print, can then become cloudy or, as the term suggests, silver. Silvering is most likely to happen on a matte finish since the air can get trapped between the decal and the rough finish of the matte coat. So on to the weathering. I'm going to start with this pre-mix wash from Ammo. I find the neutral colour of this wash good for replicating dust and general use on metal finishes, and since we've used a gloss coat varnish, it can be easily applied using capillary action along the raised details on the part. To get a nice and subtle effect, it's important not to completely flood the area. I apply it quite sparingly so that the wash seeps into the recesses and finer detail on the part. I waited around 20 minutes until the wash was completely dry. It can be removed using a dry cotton bud, and since we used a gloss varnish, it would wipe away relatively easily without the need for any thinners. If you do find it quite stubborn in some places, it's best to just dampen the cotton bud with some enamel thinner like white spirit. The neutral wash wasn't going to be the right colour for the green areas, so I wanted to darken those panel lines. For this I used a deep grey wash again from Ammo and applied it in the same way. This deep grey wash is slightly tinted towards brown, so is a good colour for replicating shadows as well as a slight bit of dirt. I thought that sat well for the most used areas inside the cockpit, particularly around the footwell. To achieve the matte finish on those cockpit parts, I used HD varnish from VMS. This again is an acrylic based varnish, and honestly one of the best I've ever used. The matte effect is very strong in this one, so will dry completely flat when given a thick enough coat. For the final details inside the cockpit we need to go back to oils. I make a dark to medium oil colour using black and white, and then gently dry brush it onto the raised details like the switches. To bring out the raised details and highlight the green areas, I added some olive into the same grey mix and repeated the process. And finally, I added the bright red and yellows onto some switches and handles for the last bit of detail. Since everything has been painted on the interior at this point, I can't really use poly cement to stick things together. So to assemble a cockpit inside the fuselage, I need to use superglue. To apply a small drop of superglue, it's best to use a small thread of solder wire to get into the tight spots and then apply it accurately. The poly cement requires the plastic to be free of paint so that it can fuse the parts together. To get the parts free of paint, it's best to just scrape off the paint using a scalpel blade. It's not totally important that you do this along every single seam, but if you do want a good join, this will definitely increase your chances. It might be hard to resist rushing, but before assembling any part of the model it's a good idea to test fit the parts first. But once you add the glue, there's no going back. so knowing that they'll fit properly beforehand is a must to stop any frustration later down the line. Unfortunately, this is something I've learned many times the hard way. When it comes to actually joining the two halves of the fuselage together, I find it best to take it slow and steady, by using the fast setting glue. Reason for this is that I glue small sections of the parts together, moving on when I'm happy with the join, so the fast setting glue works in your favour, so you can slowly work down the length. Working down the length, grow up. On the parts that had a bit more contact area, I use the thicker regular polycement. The extra thin polycement is good, but can dry up quite quickly when you're joining larger parts. Now that the fuselage has been assembled, it's time to get rid of that quite nasty through point on the spine. I cut away the excess with a scalpel blade, and then to take down the sort of nodule thing left over, I use 400 grit sandpaper. Sanding can remove quite a bit of detail if you're not careful, so I combine this with some scraping using a scalpel blade to get into the finer detailed areas. So now I've sanded all the joins on the leading edges of the spine and along the fuselage, it's time to fill in my cracks. There are a few fillers on the market, but the one I get along with the most is Perfect Plastic Putty by Deluxe Materials. This putty is water based, so can be manipulated using a damp cotton bud and applied using a toothpick. You really don't need much of this stuff, so I apply in small amounts to try and fill the gaps between each panel, leaving excess which can be sanded off later. Sometimes the putty can be quite thick and rigid straight from the tube. That was the case here, so I dipped the toothpick in water just before taking some from the tube, which thinned it down enough to work with. It's best if you leave this putty to dry off a little because it can be easily smoothed out with a damp cotton bud, rather than sanding and potentially losing some work of the detail in the process. You don't have to push particularly hard as the water will do most of the work softening the putty. A few soft passes should do the trick, removing the excess away from the panel gap. There are a few options when it comes to rescribing the lost detail. Detail is often lost during the build process either by sanding or just soft moulding around the edge of parts. Now, I'm a bit rubbish at this, truth be told, and I like to use a guide to help me keep the panel lines straight when I'm rescribing. One of the best guides to use is the Hasegawa Tri-Tool. These are metal templates with various holes and slots cut into them, which you can guide your rescribing tool around to get nice clean shapes. Then using a razor tool like this one from JLC, or a rescribing pin vise, you can use the templates to put the details back in. Or you can use some tape as a guide to run the saw along and get the panel lines nice and straight. So depending on what sort of rescribe job you're going to tackle depends on what type of equipment you're best suited to use. The final step of the main assembly was to attach the canopy. I'd left this off until this point so they didn't get scratched during all the sanding phase. Then whilst it was still under clamps, I used VMS extra thin superglue to secure it in place. Okay, so now it's time to start priming the model. If you're into aircraft modellings or just making a start, I suggest that you get an aircraft jig like this. This type of jig will help you rest the model on an elevated position, so you can easily spray around it without having to touch any part whilst it's wet. All four heads are fully adjustable up and down and in and out along the axis, so will fit most 172 and 148 scale model aircraft. I've actually designed and made this one and it's available from my website, so if you're interested in this jig there's a link in the description below. When it comes to priming the model, I like to do a tester first. This tester is to prime all of the joint I've worked on during the build to see if they have any imperfections. Sometimes it can be hard to see how good or bad a joint is until we get some paint on it, so before I start getting excited and applying the paint, I better check this first. And as you can see now the primer is dry, there are still some seam lines still visible. To fix this I repeat the filling process on the areas that need neatening up. This time I don't remove the excess with a damp cotton bud, but instead wait until the putty's gone completely dry, and then smooth out with some 1200 grit sandpaper. Okay, so now I think we're good to go with the proper primer. For this I'm going back to the Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. This primer is the smoothest that Mr. Surfacer makes at 1500 grade, but it still needs thinning. The best way I find to tell the paint is thinned enough is to spray a thin line. What you're looking for is a nice smooth spray pattern with little but ideally no spatter around the edge. I don't tend to measure out exact thinning ratios, but I could take a guess that it's thinned to around 50-50 with the Mr. Colour self-leveling thinner. That should be a good starting point, and then finely tuned one drop at a time for your setup. I apply the primer in thin coats to build up the opacity until it becomes completely black. I never flood the model as this can cause the finer details to be filled by the primer or the paint. To mark out the parameters of the camouflage scheme, I printed off a 1:1 scale print of the scheme I found online. You can find these quite easily by a Google search, or if you're really struggling, scanning the instructions and scale it from there. Transferring the camouflage scheme this way gets all of the shapes and sizes accurate. You could go ahead and try and copy it straight from the instructions yourself, but I find this way better. With the individual pieces cut from the scale print, I transfer these onto the model using the panel lines to align the pattern. Then using an engineer's pencil I transfer the edges onto the model. For the main paint scheme I'll be using AK Real Colours paint set for the RAF Temperate Land Scheme Camo. This is a great little set that has all the paint you'll need to recreate this camouflage scheme. The AK Real Colours don't come pre-thinned for the airbrush, but there is a little trick to get them set up to spray straight from the jar. When the paint is supplied, it's only filled up to the base of the neck on the jar. I'd recommend using the same manufacturer's thinner to stop any mishaps like making the paint go gungy or just not any use at all. You can use Mr. Colour self-leveling thinner on these paints though, because that works well too. The trick is to add the thinner to the jar, almost levelling the jar up to the top of the neck. This works out around about 2.5 millilitres. After a good shake, the paint should be good enough to spray straight from the jar. Again, like with the primer thinning, you're after a nice smooth spray pattern with little to no spatter around the edge. Some fine tuning might be needed with a drop or two extra of thinner, but this is a good basis to work from when taking it straight from the jar. Just for reference for the main painting using the AK Real Colours, I spray at 10 psi using my 0.15mm nozzle. The first colour to go down will be the lighter shade. On this camo scheme that's the dark earth. Since this camouflage scheme has soft edges between the two colours, I'm going to freehand the entire thing using the pencil line as a guide to make the right shapes. The AK Real Colours paint is fantastic at doing this if thinned correctly. The spray is nice and smooth so there's almost no overspray around the edges. I start by following the pencil lines to create a boundary to fill the colour in. Once I'm happy that the edges are defined, I start to fill in the centre using a marbling technique. This method uses the black primer to create contrast within the same colour of paint. This means different opacities can be created so that the surface finish looks more varied, and more like a real aircraft. The key when using this technique is to create a random pattern within each panel. Then once the first layer has been complete, go over the pattern again and fill in the darker spots. By doing this, different thicknesses of paint are achieved and some areas will look lighter or darker than others. With the first colour of the camouflage complete, it's time to move on to the dark green. I spray this using exactly the same method as I did with the dark earth. I start with the edges to define the boundary of the camouflage pattern, and then filling in using the same marbling technique to get the variation of colour within each segment. Again, I spray these colours at 10 psi and trying to keep quite close to the model to stop any chances of overspray. The AK Real Colours perform perfectly for doing this freehand method, but if you're uncomfortable doing this, I would suggest using Blue Tack Office Putty to mask the boundaries on each colour. The Blue Tack will create a soft edge similar to what you see here, but without the risk of any overspray or slips when performing freehand. To see how that method's done, take a look at my snow area build on my channel. And whilst you're on my channel, hit that subscribe button if you're new here, as I've got loads more videos like this on the way. The top side was complete, so it was time to move on to the underside. This video isn't necessarily about making the most accurate Spitfire, but on the box instructions the underside calls for 3 different colours: silver, white and black. But if you look at the reference photos of the Mark I, the underside is just a centerline colour split of black and white, so I'm going to follow that instead. I carefully mask off the top side using Tamiya tapes I showed earlier, and then use Mr. Surfacer White to create the white side of the scheme. White can be a tricky colour to paint, and I find Mr. Surfacer the best paint to use for white, even though it's technically a primer, but you'll never know. Main paintwork complete, it was time to move on to the smaller detailed work. To mask off the tyres so that the wheel hub could be sprayed, I use VMS masking liquid. You can carefully apply this using a toothpick around the wheel hub so that a perfect seal to the tyre is made. Now it's time to prepare the surface for the decals. Just like with the cockpit decals, a nice smooth gloss surface is best to use to reduce the chances of silvering on the carrier film. To create a suitable gloss coat, I use Mr. Colour Super Clear 3. Which is thin to around 50% with self-leveling thinner. To reduce the chances of the clear coat becoming frosted through overspray, I work towards the model rather than away, so the overspray can be covered by the following flow. It's especially important when using this clear coat and thinner combination because they are quite aggressive and can actually burn the paint layer below. I always start with the dust coat that doesn't appear wet and let that dry off for around 45 minutes before then applying the wet coats to build up the layers of gloss. I usually make around 3 wet coats, waiting 45 minutes between each one to build up the gloss coat suitably for the decals. I'm going to use the decals straight from the box on this one. Unfortunately they're not really that good with this kit despite the kit being new. They're really thick, which won't do us any favours when it comes to getting that painted on look. To help us get the decals softened and conforming to the shapes in the model, I use Tamiya Mark Fit Strong. This solution, as the name suggests, is a stronger all-in-one solution compared to others available. After the individual decals have been cut from the decal sheet and softened in warm water until they easily come off the carrier paper, I apply them onto the model using the Mark Fit Strong solution. I give it a few minutes for the decal solution to take effect, and then start to remove the excess solution by using a cotton bud. This also presses down on the decal, helping it stick to the model better. The larger decals like these roundels will need a lot more decal solution to get them soft enough so that they can form around the shapes on the model beneath. I tend to soak these decals in warm water for a little longer so that they really soften up before I apply them to model. As I started to see the decal was softening with the decal solution, I start to roll from the centre using a dry cotton bud to remove the air from underneath the decal. This helps it both stick and start to conform to the shapes underneath. The process of adding the solution over the top is then carried out more times until the decal starts to witness the detail of the model underneath. After each time the solution had dried off, I roll the decal to get any remaining air from underneath it. This whole process can take several hours and the effects might not be visible properly until the next day, when everything's thoroughly dried out. Some of the decals will cover panel lines and other details of the model underneath. To make sure these panel lines are still as prominent as the others, I use a scalpel blade to slice the decal along the panel line. I do this while the decal is relatively soft so that it will conform into the cut as the solution sets. Once the decals have been completed, I leave until the next day before I apply a gloss coat to seal them in. I make 3 layers with Super Clear 3 acrylic varnish, which will set us up for weathering. Since my weathering is oil based, the varnish needs to be acrylic or lacquer based, so that it doesn't react with the thinners of the enamels. I decided to leave off the red squared decals that cover the gun openings on the leading edges of the wing. I knew that they wouldn't conform very well since the decals were thick, so now it's time to paint them. I used a grey base coat from Mr. Surfacer and then applied a darker red mix onto the required areas. To keep the overspray to a minimum, I sprayed away from the model's direction. Taking a closer look at the decals now that they've had time to cure properly, you can see that there are witness marks as they don't sit level on the surface. To solve this, I take a step from auto body shops and car modelling. The surface needs to be flattened down, and to do that we need some fine grit sand sponges. I start with 2000 grit and gently sand the surface until it becomes smooth. This step isn't absolutely necessary and a bit more advanced than modelling fundamentals, but I find that it's a good way to get a nice smooth finish on the finished model. It's important to take care when sanding the surface like this because it's very easy to rub through. I apply barely any pressure and almost let the sanding sponge do the work for me. Extra care is definitely needed on raised details and sharper edges like on the wings, as it's too easy to rub down all the way through to the primer. Now we can see that the surface is sitting nice and flat. The witness has almost gone from around the edges of the decals, but there's a little more work before we start weathering. I make one more pass with the sanding sponge, but this time I use an even finer grit of 3000 to create an even smoother finish. By sanding the clear coat smooth also sets us nicely for the weathering. The model now has a very smooth satin finish which will help the oils stick to the model more than they would with a gloss coat. I don't really know how to explain this best, but try to imagine cleaning a glossy kitchen tile. It's much easier to clean the dirt off that than it would be off a rougher tile you'd see outdoors, which typically are a matte finish. To help me try and explain this, I've drawn this excellently professionally created illustration. You can see that the gloss coat is very smooth, whereas the matte coat is quite rough, and the satin will sit somewhere in between. With the material science lesson now over, I'm going to put that theory into practice. I'm not going to go too heavy with the weathering on this one to try and keep the techniques a bit more basic. To start this, I want to subdue the contrast of the camouflage scheme, as well as add some dirt and detail into the panel lines. I chose the deep grey wash from Ammo since this will bring out some more dirt tones without being too dark. You see a lot of people using black washes on models, which I think gives a more stylised look, rather than what you would actually see on a well-used aircraft. To stay away from this stylised and almost cartoony look, I always try to use a colour either on the dark blue or dark brown hue. For World War II aircraft I tend to use a more brown, whereas on the more modern subjects I go a little bit more blue. The colour that I choose does depend heavily on the colour of the camouflage scheme though, so if you find yourself with an overall grey aircraft, it can often look more natural if you stick towards the bluer colours. I apply this wash directly from the pot along each panel line and wait until it's gone touch dry. And by touch dry, I mean that there's no wet puddle sat on the model, which will just streak when we come to wipe it off. To wipe off the excess enamel wash, it's best to use something soft. I find cotton pads to be perfect for this. I gently wipe off the oils that sit outside the panel lines so that the surface becomes uniform again. I tend not to dampen the cotton pad with any enamel thinner, and just rely on the surface finish of the satin coat to allow me to remove most of the unwanted wash. If you do find that some areas are stubborn and really won't move with a dry cotton pad, then it might be worth adding just a small amount of white spirit or another enamel thinner to remove it. The top's finished, so now it's time to move on to the bottom. I'm going to use neutral wash from Ammo, since this one's a little bit lighter than the deep grey I used up top. It's important to be careful not to get too much contrast when applying the washes, or it will start to look unnatural. I chose this lighter wash for the bottom, so that the contrast wasn't too high against the white section, but also brought out the dust colours in the black. These first washes are used to create a roadmap, if you like, for the following detailed weathering effects. I like to use washes almost like a filter to set the colour tones for the streaks and other grime that we'll add in the next step. When it comes to removing the oil wash from the model, it can be a good idea to wipe in the direction of airflow or gravity. Especially with a satin or matte varnish to work on, some of the wash will get left behind, and as it's removed create small streaks. If you can get these into the direction of airflow or gravitational pull, that'll help make the model look a bit more realistic. Some of the finer details won't get clean enough just using the cotton pad technique. To get into all the recesses of the smaller details on the model, you might need a cotton bud to clean those up. Now that we have a roadmap laid down, we need to seal that in before we move on to the more detailed weathering. And because we need a good rough base to work from, a matte varnish is ideal to use. Again, since we're going to be using oil products, this varnish is acrylic based. I apply this layer of clear at least an hour after the first wash has gone down, so that the remaining oils in the panel lines have time to dry out. I gave the entire model 2 good coats and then left it until the next day before I did any further weathering. Okay, now it's time to get creative with some oil paints. You don't need a massive collection of oil paints, since a lot of them can be mixed together to create a lot of different effects. To create grimy colours, I find that an olive green, dark brown, black, and one of my favourite colours, which is industrial earth, are the best ones to use. Also, oil weathering needs to be completed using a brush. AK offers a useful set of weathering brushes in their survival set for weathering. This set contains various brushes that you can use to create the different types of effects. You also need some sort of palette to store the paints on whilst you work with them. I'd recommend something like this, which is a slate coaster from the Oxted Model Centre. Because the slate is non-porous, the oils won't seep into it and dry up whilst you work. They can also stay fresh for about 3 days like this, so you can weather at your own pace. To create the streak effects, I mix the grimy colour using the industrial earth and dark brown oils. I then applied that directly onto the model, using dots at the key areas and copying from my references. Without leaving any time to dry, I dampen a flat brush with enamel thinner. In my case, that's white spirit. The brush will be almost dry and contain only a slight amount of thinner, or this technique won't work as well. It's also important to apply barely any pressure, as this will also remove the streaks completely. I find it more controllable if I do a few passes rather than try to create the streaks in one hit. I work from one end of the wing to the other. By the time I've done this, one side of it is dry, and I can assess how much the streak to continue and where to apply more or less pressure to remove or retain some of the streaks that are made in the first pass. To see this process in a bit more detail, I use this technique on my Tamiya P38 Lightning build, which used a range of different colours to create a deeper surface finish than on this one. I wanted to add a little bit more of a rough and dirty texture on the walk area of the wing root. I used Ammo's neutral brown for this and applied it straight onto the area that I wanted to cover. The wash needs to be completely dry for this technique to work. I sped up the drying time with a waft from the heat gun, which was set at a low temperature. Then, using an old and quite stiff bristle brush, which is dampened with enamel thinners, I agitate the oils to create the stippled effect and blend some of it in with the surrounding paint scheme. To keep the brush from just spreading the oil around the area, I keep it clean by brushing off the excess before going back for another pass. Once it's dry, the edges can be quite sharp, so these can be softened using a dry cotton bud so that they blend a bit more into the background paint. To create more detailed grease and oil stains, I add the industrial earth coloured oil paint directly onto some of the panel lines around the engine cowling. I keep this oil to just a thin line that covers the panel gap between the two parts. Then, using a fine pointed brush, I dampen it with enamel thinner and then dissipate the oil along that panel line. The tapping motion allows the enamel thinner to agitate the oil and alter the opacity. This makes the oil appear more like a stain on the surface caused by small leaks and handling marks from dirty hands. After some work, you can get to the point where you can manipulate the direction of the thicker parts of the oil and put it in the direction you'd like to make the stains. To make the exhaust soot, I use a very thin mix of AK Real Colours smoke. This part has been pre-thinned using the method I showed earlier, and then I added a further 12 drops directly into the mix in the airbrush to spray it really thin. Chips came from silver paint applied onto the model using a toothpick. You can also use a pointed tip paintbrush, but I find this a little bit more difficult to control, so prefer this method. It's really easy to get carried away doing this, so following a reference photo is a good idea to keep it looking genuine. Onto the underside now, and I use the same techniques as I did before, but using slightly different colours to create the different effects. Firstly, I started off with the streaking by applying grime coloured oil spots around the centre of the wings. The colour is made up again of using industrial earth and the raw umber oils. This was then streaked using a flat brush to create longer oil streaks that come from the engine bay, and is evident in various intensities on reference images. To create more concentrated streaks, I added small sections of a darker mix of the grime colour oil, and then individually dissipated with a pointed tip brush that's been dampened with enamel thinner. Again, if you keep working at these areas, eventually you'll be able to manipulate the oil into the direction that you want it flowing. Also, keeping the brush clean will help you keep the streak intact rather than spread it over a larger area. See in this more zoomed out shot that working the oil streak takes several passes, and I'm keeping the brush clean with fresh thinner throughout the whole process. I also use this technique a lot when working on my RAF Phantom build to create all the grease and oil stains between the maintenance and access panels on the underside. With several sessions using a variety of colours, you can build up a really deep effect and replicate many different types of weathering. To add a bit more variety to the otherwise quite bland underside, I added a dot filter using some neutral browny coloured oil paint mixed from raw umber, white and just a spot of yellow ochre. This was then dragged using AK's flat brush, which was dampened with enamel thinners. Just like on the top side, this took a few passes to get the streak blended correctly. I did the same on the opposite side, but since this was over a black base, I used slightly darker colours so that the contrast wasn't so high. If you're trying to replicate engine oils and greases, this is a great product from Ammo. This works the same as regular oil washes, but has a slightly different makeup so it dries a little bit more sticky and also has a gloss finish. The colour I think is excellent and serves as a good contrast against the colours I previously put down to replicate the streaking. I blended this in using the same process as the more concentrated streaks to get a bit more of a stained effect over a streak. It's important when you're doing any of this type of oil weathering not to flood the area. Applying too much enamel thinner will effectively just make the oils into a watercolour consistency, and when it dries it will all end up just one big mixed up colour. To stop this from happening, start off with a small amount of thinner and see how the oils below react. It takes a few seconds for the enamel thinner to bind with the oil on the model, and then you should be able to start moving them around. Next up, I wanted to create some mud spatters from when the aircraft had landed on wet ground. I got the stiff-haired stipple brush and filled it with a neutral brown coloured oil mix. Then using a toothpick, I flicked the brush along it to get small spatters of the oil onto the landing gear door. To create the dust effects, I used spot-on pigments from VMS. I chose European brown earth and applied it using a dry brush. If you've never used pigments before, it's a good point to use them sparingly. Best applied over a matte surface, there's no need to use any pigment binder or fixer, as it will stick to the rough texture of the matte finish. I applied some more to the wing walkway and cockpit access, then feathered in using AK's fan brush. The main part of the model is now complete, so I moved on to the smaller parts by basing the exhaust stacks with Alclad jet exhaust. This colour isn't quite black and slightly metallic, so acts as a good base coat for the AK Extreme Metal steel colour I lay over the top. Both the AK Extreme Metal and Alclad colours are pre-thin for the airbrush, so there's no need to worry about getting them mixed correctly. Just run some acetone through the airbrush once you've finished to clean them out. To give a slightly burnished effect from the heated metal, I very faintly applied Alclad Pale Burnt Metal to tint the steel base colour a subtle yellow gold. The propeller tips need to be coloured in yellow. To bring out a more vibrant yellow, I first base the masked off areas with grey primer, before using Tamiya XF3. And now we're almost there, it's time for the final assembly. Since all of the parts are now painted, I'll be using superglue from VMS. Since this kit's relatively simple, there aren't many parts to add on as part of the final assembly, so it's on with the exhaust stacks and landing gear before removing the canopy masks. The only bit of scratch building I'm doing on this model is for the radio antenna wire. I use fishing line of some sort of lightweight and attach it with the VMS extra thin superglue. To speed up the drying time, I use superglue accelerator to instantly create a bond between the two parts. With that sorted, a quick coat of black paint finishes it off. And the final part, the propeller. Wow, I've not stopped talking. So there it is, my version of what I think are the fundamentals of making a scale model. Yes, I may have used some professional equipment, but that's the sort of stuff you build up over a few years of modelling. And also this video is designed to show the basic modelling skills and equipment you need, so it's not to be confused with a starter set challenge. With all that said, I hope this video can at least help guide you in the right direction when it comes to paint thinning and application, some oil weathering, and maybe even help you out building a model as well. Thank you very much for watching. This was Airfix's 172 Spitfire Mk.I. I'd like to say thank you very much to my Patreon supporters who helped me create this content for the video and inspired me to make it. If you're interested in joining them, there'll be a link in the end screen, or if you can't wait, there's a link in the description below. The benefits of being a Patreon supporter are one-to-one messaging directly with me. We also have Zoom calls and a community chat via a private Discord channel. We even have exclusive discounts to active contributors in the Discord chat. Finally, if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give me a follow on Instagram using my Instagram handle, theinnernerd_insta.